So we've had some good progress then since the last. Just a way to apply styles inline to elements directly in Imba, and also to create global and scoped style rules with an Imba syntax, like directly in the language. So instead of adding styles either through external style sheets or through the CSS comment blocks that we had before, I've basically moved that styling inside of the main language, so to speak. It started out just as inspired by Tailwind. It's a bunch of utility classes that you could add to inline components to add these basic constrained types of styles, like what kind of, whether an element is a block or a flex box or a grid, and the color of it, and like predefined utility classes, just like in Tailwind. And that was already, that felt pretty good to use after I had experimented with the syntax. But you will at some point, you will need to drop down into CSS again. Like you can't do everything with these utility classes. Since we're not constrained the same way a library like Tailwind is, we're essentially allowed to invent new syntax. It made a lot more sense to actually take the essence and ideas from Tailwind and other utility frameworks, and then just integrate that with the full power of CSS. So I could go through like just a few examples. The syntax highlighting here is kind of broken, so it won't look that good. But essentially the current syntax for it, for inline elements, in Imba you have these, as we all know, you have these classes like like you can panel something. They are separated by dots. And you can also do dynamic classes by using curly braces. So this is essentially like if you have an expression here, it will add a class on the tag with the name of that expression. So we added a different syntax for this, where you have dot and then just regular parentheses. And you can look at whatever you write inside of here. You can look at that as kind of an inline anonymous style class. So you have a bunch of style properties. You can use whatever you write inside of here. You can use any kind of real CSS, like regular CSS. You can separate the different stylings, like font, weight, bold, using semicolon, like in CSS, but you can also skip them. So you can essentially just separate them by space. This kind of looks like an inline style where you actually apply these properties directly to the elements. Mm-hmm. But if you look in the inspector, you will see that it is essentially creating generated class name with the properties, and then it has set that class name on the element. And the main reason for this is basically reusability. So when you use these in templates, you don't set these style properties of the elements in all the instances of a component. And it also allows for more fancy features. And that is one of the cool things of Tailwind, is that they generate a bazillion classes, so that you can set classes for specifically for like set this color when element is hovered and stuff like that. So for that we have style property modifiers. I'm not sure the naming conventions we are going to end up using. I guess when we write the documentation we will, and we'll figure that out and try to be consistent when we reference different concepts. So right now I'm probably not that consistent. I might end up calling them a bunch of different things throughout this explanation. But the whole point is that you can set stuff like, so color :red, and you can do color dot and then a bunch of different modifiers. So hover it is one of them. So this basically says that the color should be red, and when you hover, the color should be black. If you look at this example now, is this running? Let me see. I'm using the playground from, I'm using the buggy playground from my local host. So I'll just see if something happened. Yeah, there was some weird glitch there. So you see now that when you hover this, the element becomes black. So this is the basic idea of these inline styles. It makes it very easy to add small style stuff throughout your components directly inline. But sometimes, as you know, if you've worked with something like Tailwind, you might often end up with a huge bunch of inline styles for for various elements, and that becomes quite messy quickly. So it's important to also be able to pull out styles that you repeat over and over out from these inline things. I don't have any good example right here, but I can probably find one. Like, in addition to general CSS, we also support a bunch of constraints where we have kind of a theme that you can configure, where we have already predefined a bunch of colors. Right now, they're just copied or borrowed from Tailwind. And we have a bunch of convenience properties and aliases that makes it easier to do a lot of the things that you usually use CSS for in web applications. So you can do these inline styles. We also have some powerful new CSS properties, like we've extended CSS kind of with a few specific properties like layout, text, and a few others that allows you to much more concisely describe the layout of your components. Like, very often you end up writing, always having a position, you always have a display property and a bunch of other things like overflow. Is it going to clip? Is it going to be scrollable? The layout property, which isn't documented really right now, is a shorthand for setting a bunch of these different layout related properties all at once. And we have shorthand aliases for often used properties like padding, margin, stuff like that. So I think I can show some of. So aliases for padding, for example, is you have P for padding, you have PL, PR, PT, PB. Those are just straight up aliases for existing CSS properties. But you also have PX and PY, which are really useful because they set both padding left and padding right at the same time, and padding top and padding bottom. And the same goes for margin. So if I have this panel thing here, you can see that you could do like P0. Now it has no padding and it has no, this is, I can talk about this later. These are the predefined nice colors that we ship with the built-in theme. So P10 pixel, that is padding the whole thing, but PX would be just padding the both the sides, and PY would be top and bottom. So we have a bunch of aliases. Those are still kind of in flux. We are working on them, changing them, making sure all of them make sense before launch. The next thing I wanted to talk about was that sometimes these styles become messy. I think we have an example here where you have a panel and where you essentially end up with a huge bunch of inline styles. Sometimes it makes sense to start moving those out into the component body. And this is what you can do here. So in addition to prop and def and get and set and after, we now have a CSS keyword that you can use here. So I can simply just write CSS.tab and then add the styling here, and it will generate a scoped style rule for styling everything with class name tab inside of app panels. So then you can start like moving. Now I basically replaced all of this with just that class inside here. And you can also nest these. So as you can see here, I had an inline conditional style where I just set color blue and background blue if page equals item. But I can move that out as well. So now I have, like you did in Imba 1, I basically toggle the active class name of this div based on whether page equals item. And then I've added a style here as well, which is, people will be familiar with this coming from Sass and Less and basically all the preprocessors. Ampersand here basically represents the current selector. So this is the same as writing a new, I could write a new thing here where it's just CSS tab active, which would be the same. But sometimes it makes sense to allow nesting. You don't want to encourage people to nest everything, because then you end up with these huge complex style rules with a lot of specificity and where it's difficult to really see what's going on. But for these simple examples here, it makes sense in my opinion. So the syntax, I might end up supporting curly braces as well, but the syntax right now is that you can either do like the selector, an equal sign, and then the properties, or you can indent it. So these two are essentially the same. Seems very natural to just support curly braces. The only reason I haven't done that just yet is that I am considering allowing curly braces, at least inside inline styles, to also allow dynamic parts of the styling. So you can imagine doing something like this, and where this is actually a property on the component itself. Another cool thing is that since we are essentially, our goal is to create a version of CSS that is truly optimized, again, for writing web applications concisely and cleanly. And CSS is, in my opinion, a pretty nice idea. But over the years, they have added a lot of new concepts, and they've had to stay constrained to the syntax and the concepts they started with. So when they added support for transforms, it wasn't possible for them to add a bunch of different properties, or it might have been possible, but they ended up with this transform property. That makes a lot of sense when you do complex transforms and custom transform matrices and things like that. But for most regular use cases, people just want to allow to scale and rotate and offset elements quite easily. So in Imba, in the inline, in the style syntax here, you can still do like transform manually and do whatever you want. But we also have a bunch of, again, extended properties that do the same things behind the scenes. So we have X, Y, Z for setting the translate offsets. We have rotate, we have skew X, skew Y, scale, scale X, scale Y. All of this is, again, inspired by Tailwind, but this allows us to really easily set these kind of effects. And it's really powerful in combination with the style property modifiers, because here, like the button you see here, we essentially say that when it's hovering, scale it to 1.2. And the reason it's animated now is that you can see that at the top of this file, I've just defined a global style rule that sets these styles for every button element. And one of them is transition with duration and, again, a custom easing. We can get back to that, but in addition to ease in, ease out, Imba ships with all of the regular CSS easings that you would see, like these types of easings. And again, the tooling is not at all ready for this. I haven't really worked on the tooling part of the style stuff just yet. I've spent time finishing the styles. But the tooling, when we get autocomplete for all of this, and when you like just hover the easing keywords, you can actually see a preview of the easing curves. There's so many cool things we can add for this. But yeah, it's very powerful for these types of regular effects. And if or when we also add support for interpolating actual dynamic values into the styles, then it also becomes really powerful for if you have some sort of draggable element, let's say, you could just, etc. So yeah, easily even make these types of styles declarative in your views. Yeah, we have some extensions for transitions as well. So one of the bad things about CSS is the syntax for transitions. If you want to transition like all of the colors, like actual background, text color, border color, things like that, with one duration and one easing, and then you want to style opacity or transform with another duration or another easing, it's essentially not possible, or you have to end up writing a huge list of transition things, or you have to just like transition property and then all the properties, and then you have to write transition delay, transition duration, transition easings. The whole point here is that using declaring the same duration and the same easing for a bunch of properties and a different duration and a different easing for one or more other properties is a huge mess. It results in tons and tons of CSS. So again, inspired by Tailwind, Imba natively supports some shorthands that represents a bunch of properties. So we have like, if you write none of these, it defaults to something we call styles, if I remember correctly, which is, I can try to just look at, this is just some behind the scenes stuff. By the way, here is a list of the current aliases. Yeah, so in transitions, these are the current groups that we have. We have styles, which is essentially all colors, as well as box shadow, opacity, and transform. Then you can also specify just sizes, which is width, height, left, top, right, bottom, margin, padding, and a bunch more that I haven't added just yet. And then just the colors as well. And that's another neat thing that is much easier to solve now that we can actually extend the functionality. Yeah, it's actually, so if I go here and then do P for padding, so if you just do a single argument, parameter, or whatever you want to call it, then it applies padding to the whole thing, right? But if you do two or more, like if you just do two, it will do the first one as top and bottom, and the second one as left and right. That works here as well. it works for all kinds of properties, because now I could again do like color red, and is actually fully parsable. There is no ambiguity here, kind of tricky to do the parsing. It even supports, like, there are a few properties in CSS that supports comma separated values. So font family is one of them. You have transition, box shadow, backgrounds, where you can apply multiple backgrounds, multiple shadows, multiple fonts, etc. That works as well, but that starts to look quite weird, because then you have like font family, monospace, then, or Arial monospace, and then a color. This still parses, as you can see, the syntax highlighting works, and it does parse correctly as well. If you look at this right here, you will see that it applies everything. Initially, we just copied Tailwind, which uses the blue 200 kind of notation. That was again taken from Material UI, I think. I just played around with just not having that dash at all. Did recently, we have also added like this. Just, we're not going to end up shipping support for all of them, but it's very useful to actually add support and then use it a lot, just to see what feels right. The only downside of doing this, in my opinion, is that you won't, if people want to use Material UI things, then they should probably use this syntax or something, because Material UI also defines like 50 values for the different colors. So you have blue 100 and blue 50, and blue 100 would be blue 1 in our system, and then blue 50. Eric said it could be blue 0, which I kind of agree with, but it's also not completely right. But yeah, that is one of the things that is just hasn't landed completely yet. Right now, you can't even extend and change the colors yourself, but that's the whole point, that you are going to be able to do that in your own theme configuration. But again, so the whole idea of this style support was to do the same thing as Tailwind. But as you said, the main experience from everyone who's actually tried and started using Tailwind is that it looks really messy, but it works great when you get used to it. So the idea of Imba here is that we want to do the same, but we want it to look beautiful from the start. So it's supposed to look nice and work really nice. Yeah, it depends on what you call beautiful. So the main challenge I have with Tailwind is that you end up with a huge bunch of properties directly inline. One of the things that will look nicer is that you can, as we talked about, you can actually extract styles into actual style rules like this, and that we can, I haven't completely like decided how we want to do the modifiers and stuff, but since Tailwind is constrained to actual CSS classes, so a lot of it is just hacks. So we can use any kind of symbol, we can separate them however we like, and we can also add these, allow for these nested things. I think I've always been of that opinion, that I really do think that these shorthand properties are much better. Like when you started using something, take an example like BG instead of background. Yeah, it looks cryptic for a very short time until you learned it, but after you, as long as the aliases are natural, consistent, then it is much better to use them, because the less code you have, the easier it will be to understand. That's, in my opinion, that's like, I know that you shouldn't call your variables by single letters and go all that way. But if you have BG versus background, it's not the same as a variable, because BG will always represent background. It's kind of like using an emoji for expressing a lot of words in a single character. When you started learning that language, it will be much easier to gloss through a component or some styles and understand what's going on, instead of having to look through a bunch of different lines and so yeah. And as I was going to say, that after starting to use this, I've converted the whole V2 site over to using these styles. There are essentially no style sheets left there. I've actually gotten rid of a ton of CSS. Things are much clearer, and it's just a joy to work with when you know that all the styling this is applied is just right there in the same file. And it's not even just in the same file, because that was a problem with CSS blocks. I think that, yeah, you had it in the same file, but it was essentially like two different contexts. You had to jump up and down to the CSS block and back, and you lost the context. When it's right there in the tag trees, it's just so easy to do stuff. So just look at the site here. If you do, so now I changed the viewport size, and it automatically like changed the way the menu works. It pops out. stuff like that. You see the layout of the IDE changes with the sizes. All of this is done with the style syntax in Imba, and it's just much more concise than it would ever be in CSS, because we use things like the breakpoint modifiers, where if I do bg lg, it will only have this property when the screen size is larger than xyz. So I think I have, so these are the breakpoints, again taken from Tailwind. Thank you, Tailwind. We've borrowed a ton of concepts from you, tried to improve upon them. So you have these breakpoints so that you can really concisely apply specific styling for specific screen sizes. So yeah, there's just a bunch of things that makes CSS a joy to work with. I really do think that Imba 2 is already a huge improvement from Imba 1, but the whole integration of CSS like deeply into the language as well is icing on the cake. It's going to be a fantastic way to create apps.